the Electile Dysfunction Podcast with Ashton Cohen.
Welcome back to the Electile Dysfunction Podcast with Ashton Cohen. I'm Ashton Cohen. I'm joined today by Frank Furedi. He is an amazing writer, author of over 25 books, including two of his most recent ones, which we'll get a little bit into today. 100 Years of Identity Crisis, Cultural War Over Socialization, and Why Borders Matter. He writes weekly articles on Spiked on the topics of identity politics, free speech, and culture. He's been a professor emeritus professor of sociology at Kent University. And we're going to discuss sort of the insane identity politics and niche cultural issues that are at the heart of so many of our public discussion today, what we refer to as wokeism largely. And why is everything a political fight? From sports to movies, what medical procedures you have to take, what you have to wear in public, what kind of food you can eat. Why has everything become political? Why is everything being associated with someone's identity? And how did that become the case from generation where I grew up in the 90s, not so long ago, where we used to fight about things like tax cuts, and now everything's a cultural, political battle. And we're going to talk about how some of these cultural battles and wokeism and some of these fights that we're having today, how that shapes up in the geopolitical landscape, how it affects other parts of the world, particularly as we see this Russian invasion of Ukraine unfold, what it means for the U.S., the EU, global affairs, a little bit more as well. So, Frank, thanks so much for being with me. It's a real pleasure. I've been reading your stuff for a while, so I really appreciate it.
Pleasure to talk to you. Yeah.
Absolutely. So start off with like the topic of your last book, the focusing on the identity crisis, which is a phenomenon largely engulfing the Western world, particularly seems like the English-speaking world more so than anywhere else. You have this incessant fixation on ideology and these niche sexuality issues. Everything needs to be renamed because it's racist. Books can't be read anymore. Statues have to become taken down. This is the heart of the wokeness problem. And a segment of our population, the progressives, have gone all in on a lot of these woke issues, departing from the traditional sort of economic issues that used to be their platform, and now focusing on these, what they call intersectionality issues. Today, you see a little bit of this with recently, the most recent example. We see a lot of this, but the most recent example would probably be this Disney fight against the governor of Florida. This what they call the "Don't Say Gay" bill. It's unfairly disdained, and it's not really accurate representation of what it says. Essentially, Governor of Florida passes this bill saying you can't speak about sex or gender issues to kindergartners up to third grade, and this seems to be like a hill that progressives want to die on. So we see a lot of this, and obviously you're in England. Much of these issues are discussed there as well. Where does this identity politics, this fixation on these niche cultural issues to the exclusion of actual real issues like inflation or wage growth or crime, where does this actually stem from? Why has this become such a phenomenon, particularly this century, the last 20 years?
Well, it's been a long time coming because the origins of identity politics begins to kick in the late 60s, early 70s. But at that point, it stays on the margins of society. And it has a bit of influence in universities, but otherwise, it doesn't really impact on public life. But then I think two things begin to happen that allow this kind of way of thinking gain traction. The first thing that happens is that in the 70s, you have what's called the end of ideology, which basically means that all the classical ideologies that used to inspire people in the 20th century have gradually unraveled. Liberalism unravels, socialism unravels, communism unravels, conservatism kind of goes to sleep, and what you're left with is a political landscape that is denuded of the classical political ways of looking at things. And I think it's at this point that identity and this politicization begins to gain momentum. And in particular, what happens is that the traditional issues that used to dominate the public sphere kind of gradually sort of decline, and instead what you have is an obsession and a focus on lifestyle. Mm-hmm. Everything from the environment and being green to being a vegan or vegetarian, everything gets politicized. And obviously, what really gets politicized are things to do with uh, your gender, your race, your ethnicity. And what makes this particularly interesting is that what underpins this politicization of lifestyle and of your identity is this notion that the personal is political
Mm.
and that the political is personal. So once politics becomes so privatized, so personalized, then you're not really that interested in tax cuts. You're really not that interested in the big social issues. You're not very interested in what kind of society you would like to create or build. You're not that interested in the future of your nation or your communities. Your horizon is narrow. And what we've seen in the last 30 years, but particularly this century, is that identity becomes increasingly segmented and then segregated, so that people talk only to people like themselves. And not only that, but identity groups begin to fragment and new identities are created. So, for example, you had the movement for gays and lesbians gradually falling apart.
Mhm.
You had groups of lesbians gradually arguing about, are you a cultural lesbian or are you a social lesbian? You have
Right.
intersectionality coming in. You have a situation where in Britain, for example, where I live, a lot of trans people and a lot of lesbians are having a civil war, fighting each other. Amongst black people, you have this idea of colorism, that people who have light skin,
Mm-hmm.
are somehow almost as privileged as white people, and
Right.
therefore there's a kind of estrangement kicking in. And this kind of continuous ghettoization of life becomes so deeply entrenched that after a while we lose sight of the fact that the bread and butter issues and the really key important issues must have a salience in our world. And that's taken a long time to kind of come in. But there's one point just to kind of explain this, which allowed this to occur, because the interesting thing is, which is very seldom discussed, is how did it manage to move away from the
Right.
universities into the public sector and then into things like the private sector,
Mm-hmm.
businesses and corporations.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember I was in New York before the lockdown. I was involved in a debate, and I explained to people that this is, because a lot of people think that this is just a university phenomenon. It's just a bunch of sort of soft academics getting obsessed. I said to them, there's no institution in the United States that is going to be immune from this. And this guy puts up his hand and says, no, 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 you're wrong, Frank. That's not possible. For example, sports,
Yeah.
American
Yeah.
sports will never allow this influence to become internalized.
Yeah.
And that's before people taking the knee. That's before you have big debates about sort of trans men competing in women's sports.
Mm.
And what you can see is it goes everywhere. And the reason why it goes everywhere is because, particularly in America, but also in the Anglo-American world, the elite, the establishment in political sphere, business sphere, cultural sphere, no longer believe the kind of values that their ancestors or their grandparents believed in. They kind of lost faith and confidence in an American way of life or a British way of life.
Mm-hmm.
And because they lost that confidence, they become estranged and even hostile to the values that their parents and their grandparents grew up with. So, American elites are arguably the wokest section of
Right.
American society, even more woke than anybody else. Similarly in Britain,
Mm-hmm.
and I think they bear the principal responsibility for the proliferation of these ideas.
Do you think there's anything in a connection between, let's say, for example, places like Japan and Korea? These are obviously also democracies. They're also wealthy, right? So, they also like some of our culture, right? K-pop. They make great films, right? And from what I understand, and I'm obviously not as familiar as closely as them, but you can put a lot of different countries in the list. You can even put even France. The president Macron famously said, "Don't bring your woke American bullshit to France," right? And you see in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, places like Latvia or Lithuania or places like that, they don't buy into this obsession over, speaking incessantly about trans rights, or it's not about trans rights. That's a euphemism they give. It's not about trans rights. It's really just these radical gender ideologies, and that they're trying to even enforce on children now. So you don't see it in these other cultures. You see it in America. You see it in England. You see it in Canada, even places like Australia. And you see it predominantly, overwhelmingly among white liberal elites, right? So is there sort of a connection between, and I haven't looked at the exact data, but I'm sure it says something along the lines of probably white American liberals or British white elite probably have like the least connection to religious observances, taking part in religion, taking part in traditions, whereas some of these other cultures, Middle Eastern cultures, Asian cultures, even Central European cultures, they're much more connected to their culture and their religions and their foundations. You think there's a connection there that would explain why it's so much more pronounced in the English-speaking world?
Well, I think the principal driver of this culture historically has been American soft power. And American soft power and its constituents are mainly created in those parts of the United States where the cultural elites have a disproportionate amount of influence.
Okay.
And that's why you'll find that California and New York are much more steeped in these ideologies than Idaho or any bits of the Midwest or the South. And when you look at those areas, it becomes very, very clear that these particular elites are also the ones that are most detached from their communities. They're the ones that are most cosmopolitan influence in the sense that they basically have got no loyalty or connection with the or organic relationship with the places where they kind of grew up in, and therefore they become much more disposed towards these things. You have the same thing in England. It's London. That's the most woke part of the country. In Australia, it's Sydney and Canberra that are like that, and that's the way it begins to emerge. And there's a connection between the degree to which you are disconnected, the degree to which you are detached from public life, and live in a very kind of bubble that's quite different to the experience of other kind of people.
Right. Supposed to be more of Santa Monica or Tribeca, essentially.
Exactly. But unfortunately, and this is what I'm really worried about, is that given the power, the cultural power of these individuals, these are the guys that run Netflix. They run the music industry, they run the film industry, they run the university, all the cultural institutions. Right. What has happened is that their influence, in a sense, has expanded way beyond the original sort of birthplaces. So you now have a situation where in Korea, in Japan, in Asia, or in Bangalore, in India, as well as in parts of Central Europe, sections of the urban population, their equivalents, are very much influenced by this. And you'll find that even though Macron has said this about France, when you go to Paris, you'll find that there is a certain resonance for these kinds of ideas. Nothing like in America. I mean, America is in a class of its. Actually, I should say the wokest place in the world is not America but Canada, which is has gone way beyond sort of the United States in terms of the obsessiveness about these kinds of issues. But in a sense, you have to understand that everywhere in the world is being exposed to this, and particularly the younger generations are quite susceptible to internalizing this because they think this is really cool.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Canada. I never thought of it as the wokest place in the world, but I could kind of see what you're talking about now. If I'm thinking about some of the major cities, it was Trudeau is certainly the most woke, I think, leader in the world. It was just a few months ago, maybe it was last year, when he was mocked for getting wrong, because LGBT isn't correct anymore. Now you have to add in like a bunch of these other meaningless acronyms, which no one even knows what they mean. So he was like, talk about the LGBTQQAI plus community, and he couldn't even get his own letters right in order. And so going off of your point that this has moved so far beyond just the academic institutions, the Prime Minister of Canada, top 20 economy in the world, talking about, for example, I think like one of the acronyms stands for Two Spirit. Like who the hell in the average population knows what a Two Spirit is? I don't even know what that means. And and another one is like there's like asexual in there, and then there's, I think, what, genderqueer. I think genderqueer is on the acronyms. So I mean, these are just like the niche of the niche of the niche of sexual identity or gender identities, and you see it repeated by people like him, by some of these corporations as well. It's beyond parody at this point. Do you think that there is a backlash to some of this? One of the things I've been kind of disappointed by, and there's only been a couple of voices on the left who are trying to bring back, hey guys, like let's talk about wage growth again. let's talk about why wage growth hasn't gone up very much. Let's talk about some of these economic issues again. And some of those people, if they even shy away from these insane radical Netflix style woke issues or rhetoric, they're just shunned immediately and called racist, right? Do you think that there's a backlash sort of forming? I mean, I think one of the most instrumental examples of that would sort of push individuals on the left to really reevaluate their position was the election, which a lot of Americans didn't follow closely, obviously. But in England, when Jeremy Corbyn went against Boris Johnson, and Boris Johnson's, he's no Ronald Reagan or something, not a charismatic guy at all. But like the Conservatives won Labour districts, which had never voted for Labour in their entire history, and it was over this insane cultural rhetoric, these insane woke rhetoric that has taken over the left in this country. I'm not sure if there's been a reevaluation on the left in England from that yet. It certainly hasn't been in the United States yet. Do you see any bit of a sort of push to correct some of these things from the very side that's currently engulfed by it?
Well, the left is no longer the left.
Yeah.
Even when it kind of identifies as the left,
right.
It's become a zombie category, which sort of lost its living soul a long time ago. And zombies are very difficult to kill, and that's why you still have people call themselves out, even though the kind of politics they put forward, is completely disassociated from their tradition. But I think the interesting thing is, as you're suggesting, is there's been a political reversal. So the middle classes and the elites are really woke, and working people tend to be anti-woke. And that's pretty much the case everywhere. They're the constituency that's most suspicious and hostile to this.
Yeah.
The problem is that although there is occasionally a backlash, for example, I was really pleased, by the way, in Virginia, the parents revolted against the way that people try to indoctrinate their children. And you had this Republican governor win just because he kind of stood behind the parents. So there are examples when there's a backlash. The trouble is, a backlash by itself is never as strong as what it's reacting against, because it's reactive, it's defensive, it's not taking the initiative. And the problem that we're faced with is that time and time again, it's the advocates of the cultural politics of identity who go on the offensive. They're the ones that raise a new issue. They're the ones that talk about a new identity problem. And our side just reacts. And when you react, you don't really have the capacity to take control of the agenda and to gain moral authority. And you're always chasing the people who are sort of initiating this stuff. So at the moment, in the short run, they're winning the culture war. They are in the lead. They're in the driving seat. And the reason for that is because our side, insofar as there is an our side, hasn't got its act together to try to initiate something. So, for example, I'm really angry that or disappointed that in the United States, people haven't learned the lesson of Virginia and tried to mobilize parents to basically go on the offensive and not just simply react when they discover that little 7-year-old Mary comes back home and says, "Mommy, I'm a lesbian because my teacher told me so." And then it's too late to react. Right. So I think that seems to be the key thing, where you take the initiative. And also, one of the things that I'm I'm disappointed by Americans and British people because they're doing the same thing, is they've evacuated education in the
Mm-hmm.
universities. That's, a lot of conservative Americans I talk to, boast about the fact I would never go near university. I'm working in the private sector, or I'm working for a think tank. Well, if you never go to university, who's going to influence young people?
Right.
You've evacuated those institutions. If you're not going to become a teacher in a school because you think it's below you, right? Because you don't like the profession, who is going to teach your
Yeah.
kids? Right? It seems to me that that battleground has been entirely evacuated and handed over to the woke side. So they basically, run the whole show without any opposition.
Yeah, and it's difficult at this point to turn the tide. I think maybe this movement towards trying to create alternative institutions. I mean, that's going to be a long time coming. That's not something you can do overnight. That'll take decades. Maybe some of this. There's been a record amount of children who are homeschooled now. Obviously, internet makes it a lot more accessible and makes it a lot more intellectually rigorous as well, because you can get information from some of the best sources and some of the smartest people out there. And so hopefully that stems the tide. And your point about it being a zombie category, I think that's a good statement, because yeah, I see this in LA still, where the people that I know who consider themselves as a part of the left absolutely have complete contempt for actual working class people, right? They think they're like buffoons or hooligans and backwards, and we need to tell them what to do. And they have nothing in common with your HVAC, technician or a mechanic or a carpenter in Middle America, or even in LA, right? If you look at the most recent election as a example, Biden did best amongst attorneys, profession I know well, bankers, HR people, professors, and the highest proportion of professions of people in the profession voting for Trump were like carpenters, HVAC people, mechanics, plumbers, that kind of thing. People who work with their hands, who have to be connected to reality. But yet, you can think that you're a part of the left, even though you agree with every single opinion with the vast majority of billionaires out there, except for Elon Musk, who they now hate. But every single one, they have a complete alignment with their opinions on basically everything. But that yet they're still, for the working man, and they have nothing in common with the working man. So that's kind of been interesting. I'm not sure this got mentioned enough. It bothers me a little bit that sometimes people can't even see that. I mean, if you want to be a part of the billionaire class or whatever, support some of those values, that's fine, but you can't have it both ways. Do you see some of this cultural stuff? Actually, let's talk about the trans thing real quick, because that's a thing that's most discussed now in the zeitgeist and the culture, and it's a thing that's like thrust upon us most heavily of all the woke obsessions in pop culture and film. Every show on HBO seems like. I was remarking to my girlfriend. She lives in West Hollywood, and if you've ever been there, so the crosswalk in West Hollywood used to be a rainbow flag. Cool, obviously gay area, that's great. But now that's not good enough. Now it has to be that. And if you've seen that new progress flag with like it has a rainbow flag, but then a black line and a brown line and a pink and a white and a blue, which I guess the latter three represent transgenderism. The black and brown represent people of color, which kind of was the point of the rainbow. So, and then it has like an intersex circle in it. So that's now on there, because now being gay isn't cool anymore. Now it's all about being trans. Why do you think so much obsession? Because even if you compare all the obsessions, this is the one. This is the one. Or is it just kind of the hot thing right now for them, or do you think there's something deeper as to why they are just all in? They're dying on this hill of supporting, say, puberty blockers, being against, like I said, they're actually vehemently against the DeSantis's bill, which says nothing about gay people, just says don't talk about sex, don't talk about gender to like kindergartners. Like they don't need to know that you and your partner, had sex last night and how you did it and all that. Why this hill to die on so much so, you think?
Well, the point is that until this point, every single identity group, sort of was based upon something, what you could call real, in the sense that being gay was about having sex with a person of the same sex. Mm-hmm. Being heterosexual was about having sex with somebody from the opposite sex. And Now what you've got is a situation where your identity becomes not just simply about who you have sex with, but how you see yourself at a particular time. So it takes the whole notion of identity way beyond where it was beforehand, where it becomes an entire invention, quite susceptible to being changed and reframed. So, for example, we have this situation where we have the first conservative member of parliament in Britain coming out last week saying that I'm trans. And then he, in the next sentence, he said, or I would like to be trans. And I thought that was quite interesting. In other words, he on the one hand, he said, I'm trans, but then he said, I want to be trans.
Okay.
So it becomes almost like an aspiration,
Right.
Sort of. And very often, for example, I have friends in local schools, and their teenage daughter comes home, and basically, they basically say, I think I'm trans, sort of, or whatever. And you sit down and you talk to them, and they've never had sex with anybody.
Right.
It's not like, it's kind of based upon any kind of, sort of track record of physical activity. But nevertheless, it becomes something that they feel, sort of captures who they really are. It's a way of almost, through an act of will, constructing an identity for yourself. And given the fact that it's given so much support on Netflix and elsewhere, it becomes, to me, it becomes to them a very attractive identity. I mean, if you look at your typical, I don't know if you've seen, there's a very interesting program on Netflix called Sex Education.
I haven't seen it.
I tell everybody to sort of kind of watch the series. It's got 2 years. It's gone on for 2 years. And in the program, it's about school kids, high school kids. The most interesting, the most sensitive people, as you would expect, are not heterosexual because they're boring and insensitive.
Right.
They're not even gay anymore because being gay is just like, it's same old, same old. It's the trans kids.
Yeah.
They are so super sensitive. They are so ahead of everybody else. They're so better at reading the room than any of the sort of boring heterosexuals that they become like the kind of the exemplars of what you want to be. So when that becomes this kind of model to be aspired to, it's not surprising that everybody wants to pile in on the trans question. And all you got to say, if you're a mother or father in England, as you're probably in California, from a middle class family, and you tell your friends, "Oh, my little Mary or Johnny is trans," the reaction you will get, "Oh, how brave!" That's how good it is. So under those circumstances, there is a lot of incentive to present yourself in that kind of way and to politicize it and to make it into an issue among certain sections of society, even though trans culture, transgenderism is probably the basis, the most nauseating form of identity politics that is around in the 21st century.
Yeah, and you have to wonder how far it goes. I mean, I hope it's not the case where it's enough people have been sort of led down this direction, and then I'm going to have someone on my show as well who went through those gender reassignment surgeries, and within like a couple months, I think there was 16 or something of thinking that they're trans. They went right into these. I believe it was the certain hormone blockers or getting estrogen and things of that nature, actual medical procedures being done, and then actual surgical procedures being performed within a year. And then obviously many of these people regret it. Some of them are gay, right? We all agreed that was fine. That was like, we aspire for people to be open about who they are, and they're kind of being led in this direction. So maybe until there's enough horror stories of people who are sort of led down these dark paths by people they trusted, and then sort of woke up from it and said, no, what the hell happened, right? And now I can't go back because I've taken these life-altering surgical procedures, medical procedures. That I think is kind of the most troubling aspect, and no one seems to care about that. It's not discussed in the culture.
Well, I think it's a very difficult issue to discuss for people because once you've been invested in the whole kind of trans worldview, and once you embrace the gender-neutral ideology where biological sex is now seen as being of no moment, and sort of where self-identification is what matters, it's very difficult to somehow sort of delegitimate the aspiration to alter your body parts and to try to be of a different sex, because the very minute you basically tell the world that I cannot live inside my body, I'm a woman captured in a man's
Right.
body, or vice versa, that gives you this kind of authority to go down the road of medical procedures. And the medical industry around these trans issues is extremely greedy and committed
Mm-hmm.
to speeding up the process, rather than to say what you would hope they would say is, you're 14, you're 15,
Right.
take a deep breath and come back when you're 18, sort of when you've had a chance to really evaluate the risks and the downsides and everything else. Sort of saying that, sort of they kind of are become accomplices in speeding things up, and preying on essentially relatively immature children who are not yet in a position to make the kind of choices that will have consequences for the rest of their lives.
Do you see a connection between this and do you see this as a form of, not speaking about trans people, obviously, but the obsession about these sorts of trans and gender issues? Do you see this as an extension of what they call like cultural Marxism, where, as you sort of touched on, after communism no longer became a tenable thing, the bodies start piling up, Stalin and Mao and all that. These people then, the academic institutions, the professors who were all about this stuff, big Stalin fanboys, couldn't support those positions anymore. They shifted into some of this intersectionality stuff, this other postmodern stuff, which then led to racializing everything, sexualizing everything, gender identity of everything. Do you see a connection there? Do you buy that argument?
No, I don't. I don't believe there is such a thing as cultural Marxism in
Mm-hmm.
the first place,
Okay.
because Marxism emerges as the very antithesis of culture, and is very much focused on society or social factors, economic factors determining everything. I think that it's very much the case. As I suggested earlier on, it's when ideologies lose their way, including Marxism, and they can no longer influence or shape public thinking, that you have this very strong personalization of politics, where you basically you have a political sort of approach that valorizes lifestyles and invests lifestyles with political meaning,
Mm-hmm.
just because there is no other focus for attaching that kind of a meaning. And I think that when it comes to the transgender stuff, that basically represents an extension of the personalist political, where identity becomes this main driver. And it's very, very interesting, because I don't know how old you are, if you remember, but there used to be a time where identity politics was seen as being a matter of choice. You choose to be gay. I decide that I'm homosexual, or I decide that I'm lesbian. It was very much seen as an act of volition, an act of personal autonomy. And then what happens is, at a certain point, people react against that. They say, "How can you say that being gay is a choice?" And they kind of invent this idea of a gay gene,
Mm-hmm.
or that there are certain biological drivers, so that kind of make you into a homosexual lesbian. So you got that Lady Gaga song about
Or this way, yeah.
born this
Mm-hmm.
way. Yeah, we're born this way. It's not something. So the identity becomes naturalized. It becomes a biological, rather than what it used to be, something to do with choice or self-construction.
Mm-hmm.
So when identity becomes naturalized and is underpinned by biological factors, I think it's at that point that the transgenderist element, can gain a lot of momentum, because it's in that sphere that transgenderism really begins to flourish. Because if you're born this way,
Right.
right, then that kind of validates your demand, your affirmation of your identity of a man in a woman's body, or vice
Do you
versa.
deny there's biological factors associated with homosexuality? What's your position on that?
Yeah, I think that homosexuality, obviously, it has got certain, in terms of that physical attraction of man
Right.
for man and woman for woman, is I think, principally cultural and principally social. And it's got to do with the way that society arranges itself. It's not there isn't some kind of inherent biological or genetic or neuroscientific led kind of factor that is kind of responsible for that.
Mm-hmm. You're saying there's essentially no evidence that we have thus far showing that there's a gay gene or anything of that nature that would do this.
Sometimes you get these neuroscientists that they always say the same thing, that in this lobe over there, there's some kind of difference between gay people and heterosexuals. I don't accept that. I think that the domain of sexuality, of desire, is a very fluid kind of phenomenon that is regulated by cultural and social norms. And I think that that's why you will have a situation where, in some societies, like in ancient Greece, where men are allowed to have homosexual relationships with young boys, you could have that as a norm, as normal, whilst 3-4 centuries later, that would be seen as an act of perversion.
Right.
And these things are I think have got to be seen in that kind of context, rather than see this as being a kind of gay people are born in nature rather than within society and culture.
Yeah. I mean, well, there is, I think, at the very least, I'll reasonably agree that there's at least some sort of a social component, because we know that, for example, there's a very disproportionate amount of homosexual children who are gay, who come from single mothers, who come from the literature on promiscuous mothers who had suffered from sexual abuse. Right, there's definitely a lot of studies showing that there's a correlation there. I want to talk to you about the other major thing, another topic of your book rather, was about borders. That's obviously another major component of this, what we call wokeness, this woke phenomenon. The idea of open borders, the idea of no person's illegal, the idea that anybody should be allowed in. You see this with the United States right now. I think last year we had the most illegal immigration ever, 2 million people. We're going to be probably breaking that record this year. Brexit was England's decision to leave the EU was largely based on immigration and things of that nature, and multiculturalism failing, and the tense nature around that, not being able to control your own borders. And yet the very same people, and this brings us to today's time, very same people who basically want no protection of our borders, who poo-poo the idea, who call border patrol Nazis and spread all these lies about immigration enforcement. They seem to be very much. Now, I obviously sympathize with the Ukrainian situation very much, of course, very much in favor of them. But the Ukrainian borders, this is kind of a joke that some people make now, and Tucker Carlson's one of them. They care very much about Ukrainian national sovereignty and Ukrainian territorial integrity when they're anti-nationalism otherwise, right? They're anti-nationhood otherwise. They're anti being able to enforce your borders otherwise. How do you see, if anything, some of that, the ideologies we're discussing that are held by the liberal elites? So they're not liberal, but the elites in society who hold these ideologies, who run all these cultural institutions and government institutions. How do you see that playing out in their response to this Ukraine-Russia situation, or coloring their response, their rhetoric, their narrative about it?
Well, I think that the thing you have to remember is that although the cultural elites are rhetorically 120% against borders, and they talk about open borders all the time, they're actually not be quite selective about what borders they like and what borders they hate. So I always thought it was very, very interesting that at the same time as they were criticizing Trump for building that wall, or trying to build that wall on the Mexican-American border, the same people that were shouting and yelling at him were also the same people that were demanding the construction of safe spaces within universities and other institutions. And there's nothing that's more like a border than when you construct a safe space. But essentially what you're doing is you're delineating a geographical area, saying this is safe, keep out. This is our kind of place.
Real quick, did you follow
they were very
did you follow the situation when Seattle in 2020 in the summer, where there was a Chaz or Chop, where basically the sort of Antifa activists occupied certain areas of Seattle, and the first thing they did was install borders around it, and then have like armed people around them, making sure who gets in and who gets out. Right. So that's quite funny.
Yes, I think that there's a kind of selective element in this, and it's a very dishonest way of dealing with borders. I think that the connection, I think, between their historical position and their reaction to Ukraine is not so much the border issue. It's to do with the fact that for reasons that I don't quite understand, in America, Ukraine has become intertwined with domestic politics.
Mm-hmm.
And that was already evident during the attempt to delegitimate Trump by suggesting that he was a proxy for Putin.
Right.
And then in reaction at the same time, some of the Republicans tried to suggest that the Biden family were just basically, sort of living parasitically from the wealth of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean, to be honest, I got to the point now where I just don't bother to read any stuff on this because I don't believe anything I read. But what is true is that for one reason or another, the two things became intertwined, which is why, in many respects, what's happened is that the cultural tensions that are domestically driven in the United States have become externalized in relation to the Ukraine and Russia disputes.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
With some conservatives, sort of siding with Putin, and many liberals thinking that the Ukraine is God's gift to humanity. And it's bad because I think we have to look at this tragic development very much in its own terms. I mean, last week I spent a couple of days in the Ukraine. I went there to check out for myself because myself and my family were refugees from Hungary a long time ago. So I'm quite sympathetic to the plight of Ukrainian refugees who are fleeing the Russians in the way that we fled from the Russians. I really wanted to see what was really going on there. And to me, the problem is that instead of trying to sort of objectively evaluate this particular war and Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, people in the West try to insert themselves into that. And from a woke point of view, what they are really worried about is that, for example, sort of there are acts of rape being committed. Mm-hmm. So rape culture and Me Too culture becomes kind of rediscovered there. Or a lot of the American newspapers were concerned about the fact that refugees from Ukraine, from Africa, were not treated in the same way.
Right. I saw that. Yeah.
As refugees. Yeah. As refugees who were like kind of Ukrainians, and they were always looking for some kind of woke-related issues
the angle
that they can highlight. So even though there's an incredibly corrosive and destructive war going on, with loads of people dying, that was not the key thing. They had to find some kind of a woke-related issue that they could highlight and bring out, and through that, it's almost as if they were trying to rediscover themselves and their issues through the struggle and the conflict in the Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Yeah, so while all this chaos and destruction mayhem is happening, they have to gravitate towards some irrelevant issue. That's probably not even true, but who knows? Even if it were true, I mean, it's far down the list of actual like the chaos and just humanitarian or anti-humanitarian sort of conducts going on there, and the war crimes that are going on there, by focusing on some story about how African refugees in the Ukraine aren't being treated as well as the white Ukrainians or something. Of course, this is also selective, right? Because you don't really hear this sort of outrage when it comes to, say, the rape that women in Middle Eastern countries are often subjected to, right? There's very, very little discussion on that. There's been a bit since this Afghanistan thing was in the news, but no one ever talks about the second-class status of women in Iran, for example, right? My mom's home country. They don't get much attention. And in fact, the people who are perpetrating these disgusting, brutal, anti-feminist, anti-woman, anti-human rights policies are seen as not so bad, and maybe we can work with them. Maybe we can make a deal, right? So that's just another interesting aspect of their hypocrisy. Do you think that, with respect to, some people posit that Brexit was a one step that many will follow of sort of the disintegration of the EU. Other people say that maybe we're heading into like more of a decentralized sort of environment or atmosphere in the West. You certainly see in the United States, places like California and Texas going polar opposite directions. A lot of self-sorting, right? A lot of people who are culturally or politically conservative moving to Texas and Florida. Not too many people moving to California, but you see a lot more self-sorting. Do you think that the EU is poised? Because one of the interesting things I think Putin underestimated, a lot of us underestimated, was that a lot of the European countries got together, increased their sort of military engagement and spending and all that, and seemed certainly more interested in countering Russia than we thought. Do you think that we're headed towards maybe a breakup of the EU or a weakening of the EU? How do you see things going forward? Are there any lessons we can draw from this response by the Europeans and the US to the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Well, the trends, the geopolitical trends, were already in evidence during the pandemic, when you had the emergence of national rivalries as different countries realized that if you're going to get vaccinations and if you're going to be healthy, you cannot rely on international institutions. You cannot rely on the World Health Organization.
Mm-hmm.
So national governments began to compete against each other at that point already. And you had the weakening of the globalist sort of world order,
Mm-hmm.
and the gradual emergence of classical competition between nation states. I think that has intensified in the war at the moment, and the apparent unity of the West is far more apparent than real, because behind the scenes you have very differential reactions. Germany is kind of involved in full-blown trade deals with Russia,
Right.
and the amount of goods they're buying from Russia, they're selling goods to Russia. Other countries are much more into breaking of those links. So I think it's a fantasy to imagine that the West has rediscovered itself through this particular kind of a war. There's an attempt to kind of almost create a world war, kind of a Cold War Mark II situation, by arguing that Putin is like the evil empire of the old Soviet Union days. I don't think that kind of project of using this war as a way of forging unity can overcome the different rivalries that are happening there. And at the moment, in addition to that, I think that Western statesmen and political leaders, are far too feeble and lack the clarity to be able to forge together that kind of unity. I think your President Biden personifies that incompetence that prevails in the West, where his mad just runs away with him in areas that are really quite sensitive. Because when you're involved in a kind of political conflict, the last thing you want is somebody to open their mouth and say things that you're going to have to take back an hour later.
Right. Putin must go. Come on, man. Putin must go. And then they have to be, no, he didn't really mean Putin must go.
Yes, exactly. So when you have a schmuck like him, sort of, playing such a central role in what could be a major international war, the possibility of real unity being forged is significantly undermined.
Yeah, and it doesn't make matters any better that somehow he picked the one person, maybe it was intentional, that's a worse speaker than he is, especially when she goes ad lib, as she speaks in riddles, nonsensical riddles. She reminds me of like when you have to like meet a word count in a paper, and you just fill it with like gibberish, like saying the same thing like 9 different times and different weird passive voice, aggressive voice. It literally speaks like this, like consistently. It's unbelievable. Doesn't help things very much. What is something that you are most hopeful about? Particularly, let's stick with like say United States, maybe throw in sort of the Western world into that category. What are you most hopeful about for American English society? What gives you most pause for concern going forward?
Well, I think that the main thing that I feel good about is that a lot of parents are waking up. And you have to remember that parents are invested in their kids.
Right.
And so a lot of parents that might be indifferent to identity issues in their workplace or somewhere else really begin to freak out when they see that their children is being subjected to this kind of indoctrination, and they are much more likely to react. And I think that's a potential very important area for creating a kind of a movement that can make a big impact in the culture wars. Just because, parents have this complete and 100% commitment to their kids,
Right.
they are going to react once they become aware. In the pandemic, what happened was that for the first time, parents listening into their kids being
Yep.
taught by teachers on Zoom, were shocked to realize the crap that the teachers were, sort of promoting. I know in England, a lot of parents that I know were horrified. They didn't realize the stuff that was being sort of shoved down the throat.
Wasn't trigonometry, that's for sure.
It wasn't trigonometry. No. It was telling kids about how horrible Britain was throughout human history.
Right.
So it was a kind of element of self-loathing and gender politics all mixed together. So I think that's really something I'm very positive about. And I also think, perversely, the emergence of geopolitics and national political rivalries may well begin to have a reality check, pose a reality check on the obsessive way in which culture politics and lifestyle politics is pursued, and may well shake up a few sensible people to begin to try to find an antidote to the kind of issues that we've been discussing.
Yeah.
What I'm most worried about is that we lack cultural power. Right? We don't have Netflix. We haven't got Hollywood. We haven't got the music industry. We haven't got the universities or any of the big cultural institutions that influence people on a daily basis. And I think that threat, that problem, is something that needs to be taken seriously. And we need to somehow find ways and means of creating a countercultural movement with its own institutions that can appeal particularly to young people and somehow, create a dynamic that could shake up the cultural elites and force them on the defense.
Yeah, it's bad when Goldman Sachs is applauded for being woke, right? It's things have gone pretty far down the line. The point about the education, I think, is quite apt. I think, I graduated high school in 2009. I'm 30 years old, and it was never even a thought. Obviously, all my high school teachers were, left wing, with the exception of one, I think. They tried to indoctrinate you, but they were nice. They didn't. I would have arguments with a couple of them, especially in history, but they never took it out on me in terms of giving me negative grades or anything like that. It was quite a tolerant atmosphere, and it was never a situation where my parents would even care about my teachers' political opinions or even factor that into going to a school or saying to school. Today, I've the same parents, obviously. They were like, if they had a kid who was in high school now, they would absolutely be, vetting the school and looking at these sorts of things because it's so in your face now, right? It's so in your face. So even people like my parents were traditionally apolitical, couldn't care less about any of this stuff, have to care now. And I think that's certainly being reflected by a lot of parents across the United States and the West as well. Frank, such a pleasure to chat with you. It's such a fascinating discussion. Where can people learn more about you, get your books, follow your stuff, follow your work? Well,
I got a website called frankfuredi.com. So that's probably the best place to look. And all my books are on Amazon. And if you want to know what I'm thinking at any one time, just follow me on Twitter, where I, sort of try, I cannot help but react to some of the stuff that we've been discussing on a regular basis.
For sure. And I'll put that in the show notes so people can check you out. Frank Furedi, thank you so much for being with me. Real pleasure.
Yeah, nice talking to you.
If you enjoyed our show, please click subscribe to stay up to date with our YouTube channel and podcast, and give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts so that we can keep delivering guys some great content. Thanks for listening, and we will be back next week. We're going to talk about the issues that really matter. Our country, our economy, the Fed, QE, GDP, BTC, NFTs, AOC, the CCP, Cardi B, Yeezy, Yellow Socks, Iran, Joe Biden's dementia, come on, man, and probably sex robots. We stand for a free and open debate and exchange of ideas. And if you disagree with anything we talk about, you are a racist and no better than Hitler. What? Let's get started.